Honored guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to the launch of yet another South African first from Satrix. My name is Andile Khumalo, and I will be your host this morning. Now, to make sure that you experience this exciting event in the best way possible, I need you to turn on your cameras right now. Let's have a look, see who's out there. Yaish, I see you there. Heidi, hello. Rick Martin is there. Siabulela is there. Anton Poshoff is there. I see Noni Ngobo. Hello, Mapoloma. You're most welcome. Lovely to see you all in wonderful colors, wonderful faces, so diverse. You're in the right place with all your diversity this morning. Today, as much as we're celebrating the launch of the Satrix Inclusion and Diversity Exchange Traded Fund, we are also here to acknowledge and take inspiration from those who've had to overcome obstacles purely because of the very nature of their differences. Beyond celebrating individuals, today we are also celebrating organizations. These are organizations taking the lead in championing diversity and inclusion, because it is with their help that we can finally do more than just create change. We can now own it.
Know what you own and why you own it. That's what matters when it comes to investing, supposedly. But here's a question. When last did we take ownership of what really matters? Like who we are, where we come from, the skin we're in, what we're capable of, and what we choose to value. It's time for change that's about more than change. It's time for conscious investing where everyone counts. A one-of-a-kind index including South Africa's most inclusive, diverse and performance-focused organizations. With key change metrics, diversity, inclusion, people development, news and controversies that represent a South African first. Real investment change for more people. Made possible by the investment brand who's been fighting for our financial inclusion for 2 decades. It's time to own more than the market. It's time to own the change. Do good, do well, do it together. That's how we become all empowered. Introducing a South African first, the Satrix Inclusion and Diversity ETF. Diversity matters. Inclusion wins.
As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, owning this change is profound. Speaking of profound, let me introduce you to our profound lineup of speakers this morning. First up, we have Duma Mxenge. Now, Duma is from Satrix, and he is going to be helping us answer the key question of why are we all here this morning? And this whole idea of choice, the choices that Satrix has deliberately made, and the choices that more South Africans like you and I now get to make. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Duma Mxenge. Duma, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Andile. Welcome, everyone. Choice and empowerment are 2 words that have brought us a long way as an organization and as South Africans. But we have to recognize that we can't be empowered if we don't have a choice. This applies to all choices, from the small choices we make every day to the big choices that alter our lives. This applies especially to the choice we make when it comes to investing and the companies we choose to invest in. At Satrix, we understand the power of those 2 words, choice and empowerment. They are the reason why we get out of bed each and every day. So why are we here today? At Satrix, we are always questioning, always seeking a better solution to a better outcome. And we are here today because of an innovative idea born out of a team-led initiative. We believe great ideas are nurtured, and our great ideas come from our people. We are here today because of such an idea. an idea that aims to empower all South Africans with a choice that can change lives. That's because we're the first to introduce no minimums. We're the first to create investment opportunities where they did not previously exist. We quickly and proudly became the people's choice because we brought investment ability to the people by empowering life-changing choices on a daily basis to more and more South Africans. The truth is, this isn't possible without inclusion and diversity. That's what we've been fighting for 20 years, creating ways for all South Africans to have access, developing first that make a profound difference. Change isn't easy. That's because change is progress. So by including all, we create further value in more ways than one. It is something we believe in completely, and other organizations do too. Together, we are the change champions. We are choosing diverse and inclusive culture to empower and alter the lives of others. It is these organizations that make up the core of our new exchange-traded funds. By giving us all something to compare with and others something to aspire to. This is done through key pillars unique to South Africa and our need for change, including others, empowering, and ultimately valuing diversity. By choosing to invest in them, we all choose those values. And change can only happen if we're all working to create it. This is a conversation starter we want South Africans to have, using the fund and the difference it makes as a conversation starter. Together, we can find new ways to empower life-changing choices for all. It might be a comprehensive portfolio, or it could be a start of one. Either way, we've given South Africans the ability to own the market. Now we're giving you the ability to own the change. With the first for South Africa, that's a must for all. Progress, change, empowerment, choice. These words have brought us a long way, but they'll take us even further because diversity matters and inclusion wins. That's how we all win. Let's be the change champions and do good together as we launch another South African first, the Satrix Inclusion and Diversity ETF. I thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Duma, for those thought-provoking comments. And like you already say, for the past 20 years, you've given us the opportunity to own the market. Now we get to own the change. Thank you so much, my brother. Coming up next is Nene Molefe. Now, Nene is CEO, author, social justice advocate, change maker in the fields of diversity, equity, and inclusion. With this in mind, Nene is here to tell us and share with us her own views on what it really means to be inclusive and diverse in an organization. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Nene Molefe.
Thank you very much for the invite to share with you. Can I get my slides up? Okay, how to be an inclusive and diverse organization. And I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me to come and share with us. So before I go anywhere, I normally like to share a model of if you truly want a sustainable approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. It's always important to approach this from the H3. Most of you would have seen this model. It's called the head, heart, and hands model. That at a head level, this is where we talk about intellectual buy-in. So what I see in many organizations, especially if you were to take the very global tragic event that happened with George Floyd last year, what we saw around the world is that many leaders, many CEOs wrote letters of support towards Black Lives Matter. And then now, the last 2 weeks in South Africa, again, many leaders were writing statements that we will come back stronger, that we believe in the country, and that is very good. In fact, it's good to work for an organization where leadership does that. However, it's important to match that which you said with your mouth by saying, how do I internalize that in my heart? And that's where inclusion comes in. That's where emotions live. So the emotional buy-in is equally important as the intellectual buy-in. And the intellectual buy-in is necessary because that's where you have the vision for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why do you even want to do it? And that's where, what I often say, that's where you find targets. That's where others call them quotas. I prefer to call them targets. That's where you find targets, plans, and business plans around this is how we'll approach inclusion. I often make light of this moment to say, in all my 24 years in this field, I've never seen a spreadsheet transform any organization. Yes, you can have all of that in the spreadsheet, but you need to move to the heart now and say, how do I therefore create an inclusive culture? And then move beyond the heart also to the hands, and the hands is implementation. This is where behavioral effort, what are the policies, systems, practices, and procedures that need to change to ensure that your culture in your organization is fully inclusive. Show the next slide, please. So yes, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, if you were to Google, you'll find a million definitions of what diversity is. But the one that I really like is that diversity is a collective mixture of differences, similarities, related complexities, and tensions. The last sentence is very important because often leaders stop there, that diversity is good for our business, is an asset, but that's half the story. Diversity, if not managed well, can also bring tensions and complexities. Hence, we say, how do we roll up our sleeves? How do we ensure that we truly co-create a culture where people feel that they belong, where there's inclusion? And when we talk about diversity, remember, there are multiple dimensions of diversity, as you see in that diagram there. There's diversity of personality, diversity of thought. Do you know that just diversity of thought, there's 4 cognitive diversities, like predictive models. There's diversity of perspectives, interpretations, heuristics, the steps you take towards problem solving. So diversity is a rich topic. So when you find issues of race and gender, yes, that's important somewhere there. But on the brown bubble, that's an important part. But then the yellow bubble that you see on the screen there is also acquired dimensions of diversity. It's important to say, what is it that we need to understand by this concept fully? And then the outer layer is a diversity of lived experience. Next slide. So this, as you know, in all your organization, you'll agree with me, it is actually risky to talk about the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you'll note that I'm mentioning equity as well, diversity, equity, and inclusion, without addressing the concept of psychological safety. Why? Because often it is not safe for people to speak up, to say, you know what, you are talking about this diversity, you are talking about this inclusion, but what is happening in my organization is the opposite of that. So we need to create an atmosphere where people feel they can speak up. So this is a term that was coined by Professor Amy Edmondson from Harvard, where she's talking about the fact that you will not, by psychological safety, we need to create an atmosphere where you will not feel humiliated for speaking up, for challenging things, for raising your concerns. Timothy Clark calls it an environment also of rewarded vulnerability, that you need to be vulnerable in order for you to handle these difficult challenges of diversity. That is why we have courageous conversations, because that's where diversity lies. If you truly want to do a deep dive and say what is happening in our organizations, you need to create a psychologically safe platform and environment for people to surface what's not going right. Next slide. So yes, you have heard the concept of unconscious bias. Whenever we talk about diversity and inclusion, we also need to realize that there's so much bias that's going on that sort of stands in the way of leadership or management decisions. So on the next slide, you see that the definition of bias, how we define unconscious bias, is that it is hidden inclination or preference that influences judgment from being balanced or even-handed. You know, the CEO can say this is good about diversity. The executive director or even colleagues could say, this is what we, but unconsciously, we could be biased. In fact, we are biased towards other people. You know, for as long as you have a brain, you have a bias. It is actually, the quicker we admit that we have biases, the better the chances of us surfacing them and interrupting them. You can never be 100% bias-free. You can only interrupt the bias, because every person has a bias, but we have to be willing to work through these biases. Let me give you examples of what happens when we don't work through these biases. We have multiple, dozens, more than dozens, in fact, different biases, cognitive biases. There's affinity bias, confirmation bias, body shape bias, you know, accent bias, beauty bias. It's amazing how many biases are out there. And why do we want to talk about these biases? On the next diagram, you'll see that if you look at the employee life cycle, at every stage of an employee life cycle, when we decide to advertise for a position, when we recruit and we interview in those interview panels, when we decide that we are doing performance reviews, when we choose who to mentor, how we mentor them, at every stage, succession planning, even at exit, at every stage of an employee life cycle, our biases creep in there. So this is the work. If you want an organization that is inclusive, this is the work that we need to be doing. How do we surface our biases? How do we become honest and say, indeed, these interfere with my day-to-day leadership decisions? On the next slide, I want to give you examples of what unconscious bias does. We've got the concept called microaggressions, as some of you might have heard. Microaggressions, what we mean by microaggressions, it is that ways in which individuals are singled out, overlooked, discounted, or ignored because of unchangeable characteristics of who they are. So under microaggressions, you find micro inequities, those small behaviors that we do to make people feel that they are not included, to make people feel that they don't belong. When you overlook me, when you discount me because I'm this age, I can use whatever skin, whatever, I can never be 25 years old. So it's unchangeable. When you overlook me because I'm this color, I cannot change that. And when that happens repeatedly, those are called micro iniquities under the broader term of microaggressions. Let me give you an example of what we find in organization. That first block that says mistakes. One person makes a mistake and the boss says, wow, you must learn. Next time, learn from that mistake. And then I make the mistake. It's like a blob forever. For me, my margin of error is this much. Somebody's margin is this much in the same team. Another example is that somebody stands up and you are interacting, you are presenting, people are engaged because we belong to the same team. And then person B stands up. And that's the moment where people remember they need to be looking at their emails, they need to be looking at their phones. Those things actually happen. You are communicating to that person that you don't matter, I don't care about you, and others can do it openly. Or you are speaking, somebody interjects in the middle and they just interject, you haven't finished your sentence, they finish your sentence. Or an example that we get a lot from women, that you speak in a meeting, and then, it's sort of acknowledged a little bit there, but then a male colleague speaks later and the boss says, wow, I like that. That's a great point, hey? And then you are sitting in that same meeting, but you know that, 7 minutes ago, I said the same point. Nobody said the wow and the who's, and you are watching people elevating the point that was supposed to be yours. It's accredited to somebody else who mentioned it after you. You might think the reason they are called micro is because it's so difficult to self-advocate with microaggressions, but they happen. We do loads of focus groups and individual interviews, and people feel that, you know what, I don't belong to this team. And because they seem so petty, people are afraid, or they don't readily share that this is what I'm going through, because they're afraid to be told that, Nini, get a life. It depends how many lives you've been told to get. Microaggressions are real. Micro iniquities are real. And recently, let me tell you, because of COVID and lockdowns, many teams have gone to WhatsApps, right? A real micro inequity that happens. We have formed a WhatsApp group as a part of the team, and people are contributing in the WhatsApp, and somebody contributes. There's certain favorable people who are contributing. After they contribute, everybody comments, and then I contribute, and there's this deafening silence. Do you know that people go through that? Nobody says a thing. And then Ms. Popular so-and-so contributes. There goes again the interaction. And you might think that I'm really dragging this point, but it's real. This is what makes people feel that, you know what, I'm better off in another team, I'm better off in another organization. There's a term, if you don't know, called mansplaining. Mansplaining is that when a man restates your point in a manner that is really, that you are in a meeting, somebody summarizes, they choose to be the summarizer of your point, and they restate your point in a manner that actually devalues you. And that is why I love, Maya Angelou, who says people will forget what you did, what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Feelings do matter. Next slide. So what can you do to create more inclusion in your organization? 2 or 3 tips that I have for you. Next slide. The first one, I've got they are freely available resources. If you haven't done so yet, if you're a leader, you want to create an inclusive culture, you can take the IAT, the Implicit Association Test. It's available for free through Google. It's a Harvard test. In the secrecy of your own screen, you can assess yourself. How unconsciously biased am I towards Black people, towards white people, male, female, people of a different LGBTQI, anything. It will give you those categories. In that safety of your screen, it will show you how unconsciously biased you are. And then do yourself a favor, it can be a self-development tool. Another freely available tool is that I'm a member of the Center for Global Inclusion. I'm a co-author of, we released it 1st of April. This is a booklet, a thick booklet. We work with 112 experts, global experts on diversity and inclusion around the world. We produced this benchmarks. They actually measure 15 categories if you want to see how far you are from best practice as an organization. You can use this, get into the website, the Center for Global Inclusion. We've made it available for free. It's a gift to the world. We developed it. It's a lot of work that has gone through here that details what areas of diversity and inclusion you need to look at, from marketing to product. It's not just about training. Next slide. You must also, a tip, use your rank, use your power, use your privilege to include others. If I have a positional rank because I'm a senior leader, I'm a partner, this is what I need to do. How do I step forward and use the power that I have? The last closing slide. Okay. Say I'm a receiver. This is really a gift. If I'm a receiver of a micro inequity, I work with you. Let's say a male colleague who works with me says something that I feel that is sexist or that is degrading, and I've never heard him say that. So the role of a receiver of a micro inequity, a microaggression, I give you benefit of a doubt. It's under the umbrella of unconscious bias. I'm not talking about bias that is conscious. That is there. Maybe they need a different workshop. I'm talking about where you're not aware your biases are like that. So I give you benefit of a doubt, and I give you feedback that when you said this in a meeting, this is how it landed. And then the exhibitor of the microaggression also has a role. Your role is you need to own the impact of what you said and not say, no, Nini, I didn't mean it. And then the last one, we go by the principle of if you have seen it, if you have heard it, you own it. So also an observer, and you don't have time for bystanders, an observer also has a role to play in co-creating an inclusive culture. So lots of tips that I can give you, but go to that free resource. There's a lot that you can learn from it around what you can implement in your organization. Let me stop here.
Nini, thank you so much for that. Wow. Hey, I hope you got all the points there. Spreadsheets have never transformed an organization. The definition of diversity also includes complexity and tension. Hey, unconscious biases, microaggressions, lots to think about. Thank you so much, Nini. Even though we're only a few speakers in, we've already covered great ground on change, inclusion, difference, and diversity. We started off with great insights from Duma earlier. Wendy weighed in with her experiences and insights from her book just about how organizations should be taking the issue of diversity and inclusion. And of course, Nini giving us some practical tools that we can all use in our environments on how we can drive inclusion and how we can drive diversity. So this morning we've taken the broad view. Now it's time to narrow the focus and get a lot more technical. It is now time to look under the hood and see what this new Satrix Inclusion and Diversity ETF is all about. To help us, we do have speakers that are lined up that come from the technical side of things. Investment engineers, Rebecca, global fintech company Refinitiv, and of course, South Africa's leading provider of index tracking products, Satrix. So, what exactly is the Satrix Inclusion and Diversity ETF? And how does it work? First up, please join me in welcoming Laura Bosch from Rebecca, who will be helping us answer that question. Laura, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Andile, for giving me the floor. It's a great pleasure to share a bit more in depth the topic of diversity and inclusion and why it matters for the investor community. And what I want to focus on in today's presentation is not only that business case for the investor community and why we should be considering diversity and inclusion across our investment decision-making process, but also how can we start incorporating diversity and inclusion considerations across our investment process. So firstly, maybe taking a step back and sort of reflecting on why diversity and inclusion matters. I think the previous speakers already made a great job sort of pointing out the empirical evidence on why we should be looking into this topic from a moral perspective and from an economic perspective. But if we sort of zoom in into what the evidence actually points out and what type of resources have been published to really make that business case more consolidated, when we look into a concrete parameter of diversity, so looking at gender, there are quite some studies pointing out that if we were about to eliminate completely gender inequalities, especially from an income perspective, the global economy could actually benefit from up to $28 billion by 2025. So there is a clear economic argument to be made on why it matters to really eradicate diversity divergences across our societies. But there is not only an argument from a national perspective. So if we funnel it down to the micro perspective, so at the company level, why does diversity and inclusion actually matters for companies and therefore also matters for investors that are trying to allocate capital to those companies that can perform better in the future while also having a better societal returns? We actually come across several empirical studies pointing out at different arguments on what is the actual business case for companies to really promote diversity and foster an inclusive corporate culture across organizations. So one of the clear points that have been made is the importance of having a robust human capital management strategy and how that can really contribute to retain and attract top talent in your company, but also improve the employee satisfaction levels across your workforce. And all those components can have an important impact in the productivity levels of your company. On top of that, there are also many studies pointing out on how diverse workforces are better able to get clear insights on consumer trends and market opportunities given their diverse sense of skills and backgrounds that are more sensitive to tap into that information. Diversity and inclusion can also contribute to enhance the reputation of companies and their corporate branding. And all these different arguments are really important to consolidate that business case, pointing out that diversity and inclusion can really add to the financial performance of a company, and therefore is an important factor for investors to consider in their investment decision-making process. And then the question is, how can the investor community start looking into diversity and inclusion? How can they integrate these components in the way that they select stocks and they engage with companies? There are two key ways in which investors can start their journey in how to look into diversity and inclusion. First, it really relies on the way that we carry out the stock selection and the portfolio construction. So the way that we approach it at Robeco is through our ESG integration process. So that means that we incorporate sustainability considerations in all the investment decisions that we make on behalf of our clients. So we follow a three-step approach to integrate those sustainability components in the way that we select stocks and construct portfolios. And this is done in collaboration with financial analysts and sustainability analysts. The first step is really looking at what are the most material ESG topics, so environmental, social, and governance, and why does this matter for a specific sector? So if we take the context of diversity and inclusion and we look at human capital management, then we see, for example, that the healthcare sector is really exposed to that type of risk of opportunities that stem from their human capital practices, given that most of their value comes from their intellectual property that is driven by the employees in the healthcare sector. The second step is analyzing how those specific ESG topics can really add value to the business model of the company that we are analyzing. So if we take back that example of the healthcare sector and we look at the specific company, we can identify what type of efforts they are putting forward to really promote diversity across the organization and foster an inclusive culture, and how that can play a role in the level of innovation that is being generated within the company, and therefore the productivity of their R&D process. The third step in our framework to integrate ESG factors is really quantify how can these ESG components really have a meaningful impact on the financials of the company. So in the example of the healthcare company, if we identify that this specific company is performing much better than peers in the way that they manage diversity and inclusion, this could lead to a competitive advantage compared to peers and potentially a better bottom line result for the company. And therefore, we can say that ESG factors, and specifically human capital, adds value to the financial results of a company. But that's just the first step on how to integrate ESG in the investment decision-making process. But once we invest in a stock, we can also continue that integration of ESG factors in the way that we interact with companies. So as shareholders, we can leverage our rights by holding shares of a company through two main tools. On one hand, we can actually vote at the shareholder meetings of the companies that we invest in. At Robeco, we participate at 8,000 shareholder meetings every year. And through our votes, we can promote more sustainable practices. At Robeco, we have a concrete guidelines on the way that we vote at shareholder meetings, and we request a minimum level of diversity on global corporate boards. And if that level is not met, then we vote against specific directors that are up for reappointment. So besides proxy voting, we can also leverage our influence through the engagement work that we do with companies. So having one-on-one dialogues with our investee companies, really encouraging them to improve the way that they manage ESG topics. So every year at Robeco, we have a dialogue with about 250 companies, and we address a wide range of ESG topics. But we have a dedicated program really looking into diversity and inclusion. And we have dedicated dialogues with a range of companies in different sectors, really focusing on how they can improve their work on advancing more inclusive corporate culture and increasing the level of diversity across our workforce. Some of the topics that we, for example, address relate to talent management. And as Wendy mentioned before in her presentation, the importance of having a diverse talent pipeline by really, promoting equal career opportunities across the workforce, making sure that we have an appropriate level of diversity in different job categories, and especially looking at the top, making sure that the executive team and the supervisory board is comprised by a sufficient level of diverse team members. Another topic, for example, that we also address is equal remuneration. So how companies carry out audits to ensure that there are equal remuneration opportunities across their workforce for different job categories to ensure that there is no discrimination taking place in their organizations. When going through this journey of integrating diversity and inclusion in the investment process, we came across a couple of key challenges that made our job more intense in terms of having that direct contact with companies to understand a bit better their work. So firstly, what we encountered is that basically promoting diversity does not ensure a culture of inclusion. And that's also what Nene was mentioning before, that it's really crucial to make sure that you can unleash the potential of diversity by making sure that all employees feel that they belong and have a concrete action plan on how to become a more inclusive corporate organization. And we see that that's still something that companies are struggling with, and they tend to sort of put forward diversity-related commitments and sort of overlook the topic of inclusion. Another important topic is also the limited and scattered corporate disclosure that we see in this field. And this might be related to a lack of consolidated guidelines on how to report on this information. Having said that, however, there is also quite some momentum to advance work in this field. So there is an increasing amount of accountability being requested by clients, by civil society, for companies and organizations to really step up their efforts on how they approach diversity and inclusion. And from a regulatory perspective, there are also quite some significant initiatives, especially from the EU, to standardize the way that the financial industry looks at sustainability factors. And that will require more disclosure from the financial industry on how their portfolios perform on sustainability topics like diversity. That will have a spillover effect on the level of disclosure required from companies as well. To wrap up, we've seen quite some progress on how companies look at diversity and inclusion, but there is a sense of urgency to speed up the process. And actually, the financial industry can be a key player to advance this work. Through our capital allocation, through our stewardship work, we can be part of the solution. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Laura, for making a compelling investment case for diversity and inclusion. Now, over to Elena Filipova from Refinitiv. Elena, I believe there is a global index. How has this index been doing? And is it perhaps an indicator of what to expect locally here in South Africa? Over to you, Elena.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. As mentioned, I am Director of Sustainable Finance at Refinitiv and joining you this morning from Switzerland. It's a great pleasure to be taking part into this very important conversation. Diversity and inclusion is really a core dimension of our corporate culture at Refinitiv. And this is because three main reasons. I mean, diversity and inclusion is really the foundation for businesses to adapt to the changing needs of stakeholders. It's the engine behind resilience and recovery, which we all know how critically important it is. And it fuels innovation and growth. we are experiencing a very challenging times. We're in a century of significant volatility, and diversity and inclusion is more important than ever. Yet, based on our annual analysis of D&I data, we do see that measurable progress is stagnant. And the reasons why are quite complex, and so are the potential solutions. So I'm not going to go into detail of that today. However, most would agree that diversity is good for business, as the speakers before me have made that point quite clearly. It's important also to remind ourselves that the COVID pandemic shone a very bright light on why diversity is critical for businesses, for business stability and resilience. And as companies really look at new ways to adapt to the changing environment, diversity and inclusion factors need to be on the agenda alongside financial resilience, environmental risks, and workforce health. The power of stakeholders is phenomenal, and different stakeholders are putting a lot of pressure on companies globally to adopt to best practices on issues of D&I, whether that's investors because of the stronger business case between financial performance and D&I performance, whether it's customers who are changing their customer behaviors very rapidly and looking for more sustainable and socially just products, or whether that's the workforce, the employees that are increasingly looking to work for a company that is fair and provides job security. So with that, I will go to the next slide, please, and highlight that we as a company that power the financial industry with data and insights have been developing D&I strategies and processes for a very long time. But we believe that the reach of those are constrained within the boundaries of our operations and our workforce and the communities we touch. And we have even more power and ability to impact the broader industry and the economy at large through our products and services by enabling clients, providing them with the right data and insights to make better informed investment decisions. And that's the reason why 5 years ago we launched the Global Refinitiv Diversity and Inclusion Index. And we have always looked at diversity as more than just gender. Gender is the area that has received most attention in recent years, and that's where also corporate disclosure is more advanced, where more data is available. But it's not a wise business decision to ignore the remaining dimensions of D&I. Whether that's race and ethnicity or employees with disabilities. Those are business essential considerations that have to be looked into. And therefore, the diversity pillar within the D&I index looks at gender as well as cultural diversity. Within the inclusion pillar, we look at employees with disabilities and how companies are creating inclusive working environments for all of its employees. And within the people development pillar, we analyze more broadly whether companies are creating an environment which enables and empowers employees to be their best. How it invests in their development, in their continued development, and does this translate into higher employee satisfaction? I think it goes without saying that better employee satisfaction leads to more efficient and better performance, and this translates as well to better servicing customers in a more cost-effective way and improving your bottom lines as well as your profitability. And these three dimensions really give both corporates and investors an inside-out view into companies, meaning how companies present their strategies and performance when it comes to D&I practices. But equally important, it's good to look at an outside-in view into D&I practices. And that's what we do with the controversy pillar. We screen global and local news and media sources on a daily basis to identify, are companies walking the talk? Or are they only box ticking this topic in terms of their communication and reporting, but are exposed to controversies and scandals when it comes to D&I, as well as wages and working conditions. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to D&I data, we have to acknowledge that there are data gaps, and therefore the methodology behind the D&I index accounts for the not so straightforward nuances of D&I data. Therefore, if a company does not report the required metrics across any one of the three pillars, we cannot calculate the pillar score, and therefore it does not receive an overall D&I score. From the 11,000 global companies that we covered today, a little over 4,000 companies get a D&I score. So this gives you an idea that the corporate disclosure of companies has still a long way to go. And of those couple thousand companies, the top 100 most diverse and inclusive organizations globally are the holdings or the constituents of the D&I index. Next slide, please. When we talk about D&I data, it's really important to talk about verification, data quality. And that is underpinned by the fact that a lot of reporting is still done on a voluntary basis. From our perspective at Refinitiv, D&I and ESG, broadly speaking, is fundamental data set, just like corporate financial data or any other core data set. What that means is that we put all processes and procedures in place to ensure that data is verified, it's linked back to source documents, it's verifiable, and it's trusted. Our data is manual in nature. We have over 150 analysts maintaining this information, and actually we're more than doubling the team of our size as we speak to adapt to the growing demand for sustainability information and D&I in particular that we experience globally across all regions. In terms of sources, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we look at publicly available information, which is auditable, which is verifiable. That's very important from an index creation perspective, as well as then external sources like controversies and media. And the speakers before me made already a very solid case around the financial performance of D&I investment strategies. On the next slide, you see that the Refinitiv Diversity and Inclusion Index has delivered very solid financial outperformance across both conventional comparable benchmarks and non-conventional or ESG comparable benchmarks that are global in nature and focusing on developed markets. So I think we need to move away from show me the proof to action. And we're at a point where the cost of inaction outweighs times the cost of action. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have during the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Elena, for all of that. Really, really good results coming through from the global index, and it's very encouraging to see. But like you say, it is time for action. Now, for a uniquely South African perspective, please join me as we welcome Sia from Satrix, who's going to outline for us what's really in the index. Sia, over to you.
Thank you, Andile, and I'm excited to dive into some of the behind the scenes in the construction of this index, as we have worked for a couple of years on it so that we bring this product to South Africa. We have come up with a one-of-a-kind ETF that will track an index that offers investors exposure to JSE-listed companies that both demonstrate and promote inclusion and diversity in the workplace. But first, some quick facts on what to expect from the fund that will be listing and will be tracking this index. So on the first slide, the fund will be in the form of an exchange-traded fund, which is an ETF, and it will only be holding companies that are listed on the JSE. All the stocks that will be held by the ETF will be weighted using the free float market capitalization, and will also impose a maximum weight limit of 10%. The maximum number of stocks held by the ETF will be 30, and the ETF will be tracking the Refinitiv South Africa Inclusion and Diversity Index, which I'll touch on the next couple of slides. Once the ETF has been listed, this will be the JSE code. It's actually STXID, not STXIND. The ETF will pay out its dividends, and every quarter the ETF will distribute its income. Lastly, to make sure that the index that the ETF tracks is based on the most recent data, and if there are any stocks that we need to drop from it or add new ones, we will be doing this twice a year, end of March and in end of September. On the next slide, I wanted to illustrate how the index is constructed. So the ETF will be based on this index, and as a start, only the JSE listed companies are considered. Stocks that are illiquid to trade are filtered out of the universe, and also small companies are removed from the universe of stocks. To score each company on inclusion and diversity, we use 4 pillars that feed into this process and enable us to calculate a score for each company. The pillars are inclusion, diversity, people's development, news, and controversies. Once each company has an overall I&D score based on those pillars, then we rank all those companies and take the top 30 companies with the highest I&D score. And then finally, the 30 companies are then weighted using their free float market capitalization to make up the final index. So after looking at that, you might have a question on what is under those 4 pillars and what do we measure. There are 25 metrics that we use, and which each roll up into one of those 4 pillars, and also allows us to actually quantify the measures in order to get to the final I&D score for each company. First up is diversity. This pillar looks at if a company has any policies about diversity processes and objectives, while it also focuses on gender diversity from a manager and an executive level to any staff in the company. The recruitment process is also looked through the new women employees to see what the percentage of women is being employed in new recruits. And then lastly, the gender diversity is also looked at a board and directors level. Next is inclusion. This pillar looks at policies put in place for previously disadvantaged groups by checking if the companies promotes any flexible hours, especially in the environment that we are currently working in, whether daycare services are considered, and if the company has employees with disabilities. And then unique to South Africa, we also look at whether a company promotes diversity in ownership of the company by pulling in the overall BU scores. The BU score carries a 50% weight in the calculation of this pillar, so it is quite significant. The other pillar is people's development, which focuses on companies that elevate their employees by having skills training, internal promotions, programs for career development, and a collection of surveys in the level of employee satisfaction. And then lastly, we look at news and controversies. So for this pillar, companies which have had controversies reported on them will be penalized, especially if it's news on working conditions, wages, diversity and opportunities stories. So as an example, on the next slide, we would like to look at one company that is top of the list in the rankings and a company that is currently not included in the ETF. Woolies is the best in South Africa when ranked using its I&D scores relative to the other JSE listed companies. So when we're looking at the diversity part, they have quite a high percentage in women employees, and almost half of its board is women. There is still room for improvement in its executive and management, and there is no disclosure on the recruitment numbers. Looking at the inclusion pillar, the company does illustrate that it employs people with disabilities or special needs and has a BE level score of 6. Looking at its people's development pillar, they have policies in place to improve employees' careers and skills training, while there is also disclosure on how much they pay per employee's training. You can see that number in dollars. And then lastly, the news and controversy pillar, Woolies did not have any controversial news regarding promotions, discrimination, harassment, and so on since the last fiscal year updated. You can see that Woolies is number 1 in South Africa, number 5 globally, and number 1 in its industry group globally. Since Woolies ranks the highest according to its IND score in the index, then we can use it to actually do a comparison to a company that is not in the index. Then in the next slide, RMB Holding is not included in the index. What is important for any company to be considered in the index is obviously the disclosure of the data needed for the metrics. Looking at diversity here, RMB shows their lack of disclosure, scoring them low, and also their confirmation of not having policies on diversity processes and objectives. People's development, again here, there is a lack of disclosure, hence the NAs on the table, and just a confirmation on skills training policies. Inclusion at RMB does claim, they do claim that they provide daycare services for its employees and scored a BE level of 3. They also did not have any news and controversies penalties. Because of the scorecard, RMB Holdings scores last out of the 105 South African companies and at the tail end compared to other global companies in its industry and its industry peers. And then on the next slide, so what does this really translate to when looking at the overall index? These will be the top 10 companies held by the index according to their overall IND score. You can see that for each pillar, we can drill down and see where each company needs improvement. Lastly, before we brought this product to the market, we had to see how the back-tested numbers looked like in the next slide. So the chart actually illustrates that since September 2009, the index does show a good equity return profile and has kept up and done better than a broader market index like the FTSE JSE All Share Index, which goes to show that companies that score high on inclusion and diversity do perform better than their peers. And then just to close out, Satrix is bringing to market an ETF that tracks this index, which provides exposure to companies that value inclusion and diversity in the workplace. The ETF is created in such a way that it is managed passively and is systemic. There are plenty of other metrics that we would love to have and incorporate in the index, like mental health policies, employment of the LGBTI community, and many more. But this is a first step for Satrix. We also hope that the ETF will drive companies to realize the importance of inclusion and diversity, and also to start reporting what they do in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sia. Wow, that's a really, really interesting presentation of what this brand new proposition from Satrix is all about. Also, thank you to all the other presenters earlier on, ladies. We really do appreciate it. It is now in the spirit of inclusivity that I open the floor and take more questions from you, the audience. I see there's a couple that's already come through, and Sia, the first one is for you. The financial services sector is currently the top performing sector from an inclusion and diversity perspective by quite a margin. What is driving that? Sia?
Thank you for the question, Andile. A better working environment is a breeding ground for fresh and new ideas. And I mean, diversity in the workplace allows people coming from different backgrounds to broaden a company's ability to actually adapt to change and serve a much broader market as well. So that outcome here is also positive on the bottom line. Hence, you see those results.
Thank you so much for that. Let's move on. Laura, a question for you. And the viewer is really picking from what Wendy Luhabe earlier spoke about. Wendy touched on compliance earlier. What is your view? Are policies enough to drive real inclusion? Understandably, they are important, but do they result in inclusion, or is the outcome merely compliance?
Great, thanks for that question. I think it's a relevant one. So indeed, policies are important, but they are just the first step. So what it's needed is actually to foster that accountability concept and make sure that within the company there are some systems in place that ensure that employees are being held accountable against those policies to make sure that progress is being advanced on the ground. For example, a good way of doing that will be by establishing KPIs on, for example, the level of diversity that managers need to implement in their teams. And that will be like a very concrete action to make sure that policies actually yield the intended end result.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Laura. And Elena, the final one is for you. A research paper from a few years back stated that the world has become highly diverse, but many companies have not. Now, clearly, as this index shows, there are positive shifts being made. Probably not enough and definitely not fast enough. But the viewer wonders, all these systems, policies, processes, and measurements, are they achieving inclusion, or are they inadvertently forcing the very people who should feel empowered to now conform and perhaps mask their differences?
That's a great question, and I mean, it's important to understand that this is a journey, and many organizations are on the journey and doing their best to really have meaningful contributions and changes. But getting it right the first time is challenging. However, in our analysis of data, I mentioned earlier that we do see progress in some areas to be stagnant. And I do expect actually this year's results to show again improvement because of what we spoke about, the elevated importance of diversity and inclusion as we experienced it as a result of the COVID pandemic. So many organizations are continuing to look for the most effective way that fits with their ability to influence change.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for all of those brilliant answers. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. As much as I'd love to continue, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid it is time for us to move on. To everybody that's contributed to this discussion today, thank you very much. Duma mentioned it earlier. Empowering life-changing choices. How we make this real for more people is up to all of us. It is change on a much more profound scale, so we have to be committed if we want to achieve it. Nothing worthwhile was ever accomplished alone.
When it comes to life, you have to fight for equality. We couldn't agree more. We've only ever fought for financial inclusion and to empower choice for all, and we're not about to stop. Starting today, in boardrooms and businesses across South Africa, we're choosing to fight. And for more than just a tick box and a score, we're choosing to fight for a seat at the table, for a chance to be seen, for validation, acceptance, recognition, inclusion, success, ownership, change, freedom, for all. These are the fights worth winning, because these are the fights that matter. When we all win, we're all empowered. All empowered. Introducing a South African first, the Satrix Inclusion and Diversity ETF. Diversity matters. Inclusion wins.
Honored guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Choice and change is now more possible than ever before and for more people. This is the power of inclusion and diversity. We can do well, we can do good, and we can do all of these together. Let us all own the change because diversity matters and inclusion wins. A very big thank you to our phenomenal speakers for sharing their insights this morning with us. Thank you to our audience for being part of this amazing experience. Thank you for participating, putting on your cameras and sending us those wonderful questions. Everyone will receive a recording of this event, along with the details on claiming CPD points next week. If you'd like to find out more about the South African First, the Satrix Inclusion and Diversity ETF, please go to satrix.co.za. What the last 20 years have taught us is that bringing financial power to the people is everything. Without it, there can be no choice. Without choice, there's no real empowerment. And without empowerment, there's no future. But through inclusion and diversity, we have the chance to create more value in new ways. We can give more South Africans the opportunity to realize their own financial dreams. Our investment future is in our collective hands. Imagine what's possible when an entire country is empowered to choose. Imagine what the next 20 years could bring for you and I. That is what it means to be all empowered. So, let's own the change. Let's choose to be empowered. Let's do it together. My name is Andile Khumalo. It's been an absolute pleasure to be your host this morning. Thank you for joining us. Have an awesome day further. Goodbye.